Hello everybody, welcome to a special episode of Fmod in 2 minutes. It'll be a little bit longer than 2 minutes this time, but it'll be worth it. Recently I caught up with my friend Byron McKay, who is working as the composer, sound designer, and UI designer for Prehistoric Kingdom, which is a zoo simulation game with extinct animals. In this chat we basically go in depth into the adaptive system that he has created in his Fmod project. Really rare occasion to get into the behind the scenes inner workings of adaptive audio in a video game. I really hope you enjoy it. We talk about a whole bunch of different areas of the audio, and we're going to start with the ambiences. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Byron and we'll get started. We're showing the ambiences for Prehistoric.
Yes.
And I think people would be really interested to see how you set these up, because there's obviously, as you can see, it's not as simple as just like wind loop 1, wind loop 2, and then like switching between them. So like, how did you start with this? Why do you have so many layers? Can you go into like maybe a little bit about the implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think broadly the main goal for the ambient system in Prehistoric Kingdom was to be as kind of malleable as possible, like just very easy for me to set up, but also very easy to implement. There is a bunch of parameters over here on the right, and the goal was essentially, hey, let's have one single kind of master event and then just manipulate it with parameters, and that's it. We never think about it again. Implemented, done. So one of those is the biome and continent parameters, which don't really get updated at runtime. It's just basically, hey, what level am I loading into? And it'll set the relevant parameters for the biome or continent. And that's kind of how we get different environment sounds depending on what map you're playing on. So if I were to go through all of these nested events, you'll find a hell of a lot of nested events where we eventually get to all the source material. So for example, you can see this is the desert track, and we have a scatter instrument here that plays bird sounds depending on what continent we're currently on. So if we were to play North America tropical, we start to get all of our little bird audio, right? And so this is specific to all the different environments in the game. We don't do anything like if you paint tropical trees and then temperate trees nearby, then you get different audio. We don't handle that stuff. This is just more high level, like overall ambience.
So this is really pretty, by the way. Like the way
Thanks.
that it's set up, this looks really interesting. So somebody just jumping into Fmod, like I would ask, like, where is the loop point? Why is the cursor like in the middle of the timeline? And why do you have all these nice fancy colored boxes? Like, how does this work?
Okay, so I think that's actually something a lot of people get tripped up on it in Fmod, is that they see the timeline and they think, oh, okay, it has to be linear. It's not the case. We can create these parameter sheets, like for example, with these biomes, and kind of do stuff within that, right? So for example, here we have my time of day. So from 1 a.m. to midnight, we have this essentially spectrum of sound that I've color coded here, just to kind of keep the project clean and let me see what I'm actually looking at a glance without having to be like, oh, wildlife ambience day, okay. So honestly, color coding has been one of the biggest things I've realized working on this project. Is just how important keeping everything clean, colorful, and consistent is. That's been a major part of this project. Even here, like everything is colored.
I love it. I love it so much. So wherever the cursor is on at that point, those nested events will play essentially.
Yes.
So
So you can see here,
since there's a loop.
yes. So inside, this is just like our general 2D kind of ambience. I'll have to play that. This is our scrubland ambience. And again, this is not based on the timeline. This is a parameter sheet. And it's just going to keep looping around. There's a random starting offset. So if you were to load into a new game, the audio is not going to start from exactly the same point. It's going to start from any point within this 3-minute loop.
Fantastic. And then, of course, certain ambiences like layer different layers together, right? Different types of sounds. Maybe they're shared across different time zones. How did
Yes.
you decide on that? Is that just something that felt natural, or did the game drive that? Or
Okay, so I think really the ambient system is kind of broken down into 3 frequency bands. You have high frequency, mid frequency, low frequency. And these high and low frequencies basically just shared across everything. So if I jump in here, this is our generic container. Again, just a nested event. And if I was to play this, this is just some generic ambience, right? Just a bit of wind, some crickets every now and then. That's it.
prehistoric
But
crickets?
yes, but it's very important to note that we're missing all the source, right? Like the middle, the meat of it. There's nothing there, and that's where all the unique stuff comes in. Because what I found when I was first working on this project was that obviously different recordings have different high frequency contents, and so when you already have generic high frequency layers like this one, which I can turn on and off, sometimes those custom layers, now there's too many high frequencies, right? And so just for the sake of mixing, I was like, no, I'm going to roll off all of these custom recordings. I've already got my high frequency content. And so that's what it was. I essentially have this custom EQ set up in Reaper. So for all of these kind of just generic ambient beds, like the actual unique stuff, they all roughly fill out the same frequency spectrum. So that when it comes to mixing the game, I know, hey, I'm adding a new environment. It's going to be super easy. Just plug it in, play, done. I don't have to worry about, oh, my levels, my frequencies. Nope. I know it's good.
That's cool. That's very cool. So you're carving out space for each layer to make
Yes.
mixing later. So you're anticipating that this might be an issue later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's so beautifully simple, but it's just, and you've got everything like compartmentalized basically inside of Fmod. It looks super complicated and convoluted with all these parameters, but really it's quite simple. It's like you
It
just
is.
going on.
Like if we go back to the very top of the event here, like it's just, it's like you're just kind of diving into it, right? Like the further you go, the more it's kind of expand and open up, but it's very, as you said, compartmentalized. Um, but I think one of my favorite things about the ambience and what I kind of figured out early on as well is that like these ambient beds, they're not gonna cut it, right? Just like, 3-minute loop of just ambient sound. Like if you're playing for 3 hours, like this can't all be what you're listening to. So that's really where all these scatter instruments come in. Because as you heard earlier, like they're really what adds that kind of flavor on top of the ambient beds. And what's cool here is that I've changed the spawn rates depending on the environment. So for tropical, if I were to jump over here to my tropical, there it is. You get birds way more frequently than you would have with that scrubland, right? So even though it's still a very, I guess, generic and friendly system that I can use, it's still very customizable in being able to tweak the actual parameters and get that kind of uniqueness out of the environment.
Right. Because obviously in a tropical environment, you're surrounded by trees. It's probably denser. So you should reflect that. I assume. I haven't seen that level in the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy. If I'm like, oh, actually, I want way more birds, like crank that up, bring down that interval. There we go. It's just kind of that balance of like, oh, how much is too much, and kind of finding that sweet spot, which is pretty much what I did here. Like, yeah, there are some tweaks between them, but I kind of found some good settings. I'm like, make it a little more frequent, a little less frequent. That's it.
You may already be aware that Fmod has really powerful capabilities when it comes to testing our sounds before we put them in the game. Things like using the live update and the sandbox scene means that we can test our sounds and make sure we're not wasting our time or the developer's time before we realize that our ideas will work. Byron has done exactly that with Prehistoric Kingdom, and he's going to explain how. How often are you jumping into the game engine to test your ambiences versus tinkering inside of Fmod?
Whenever I'm making, I think, more sweeping changes to the soundscape, like for example, we have some parameters here for the camera height. So as the camera is really high in the sky, you have some change in the presence of the soundscape, right? Those kinds of changes, you really have to be in the game to feel them out, because you can make them in Fmod, but you're not going to know how it feels until you play it, right? So that's really where I jump into the game for that kind of stuff. But just for assets, generally I just kind of throw things in. But for things like the animals, for example, those are really important to actually put them in Fmod, add them to the animations, listen, be like, does this work? Does this not work? And kind of keep iterating. And we work with Unity, so the animation tooling is not the best in the world. It can be a little slow to use, but it gets the job done.
So
It's
do you
okay.
find yourself using the live update like almost all the time then?
Absolutely. This is a live update is like the best thing in Fmod. It is so useful, especially with things like profiling. Even I think you can use the sandbox at the same time as live update. So that's really cool to be able to simulate. Okay, well, if I put the camera here, listen to the soundscape in game, I can chuck my sound over in the distance in Fmod's sandbox, and then I can get a rough simulation of what that asset would sound like in game before it's actually in game, which is really cool.
I didn't know you could do that, but how would that work? Because you're virtually changing the camera in Fmod, but that's not changing anything in Unity, is it? If you're changing the sandbox position.
No, it's not. I think it's just more of a
You can test a little idea and then
that's kind of what I meant. Like for example,
it's cool.
I don't know, if I didn't have like a dinosaur in the game yet, I'd be like, oh, okay, if I put my camera here, I'm like a little higher up. I mean, I guess you could simulate an Fmod anyway, but sometimes I do that.
Yeah, no, no, no.
Not really necessary.
No, I didn't even consider doing that, but of course it's like, okay, this isn't quite right in Unity, so let's jump in Fmod. Let's try something. Okay,
Absolutely.
this configuration could work in the sandbox, and that gives you a better idea of what you need, and it helps not having to stop the scene
Yes.
in Unity and then jump to Fmod, change things, then
Yep.
start the scene again. Especially when the scenes get bigger, sometimes it takes
Yes.
it's that 10, 20 seconds in between that just ruins your flow, right?
Oh, our project, it's so big at this point. It takes like a minute 30 before I'm actually back in the game. It's like if I'm going to play in Unity, I'm committing to that. Like no going back. I got to commit.
Right. Which is so lucky that you have the live update then, because otherwise,
Yes, yes. Um, there's some stuff we'll get to later, but especially with the animal foley, which I set up, because I build so much of those in Fmod while looking at the game in real time, without live update, like that literally would not be possible, and I'd have to do something entirely different for my foley.
a big consideration when working on large projects like this one is making sure we are as efficient as possible when designing and implementing our sounds. Byron in this next part talks about probably my favorite part of this whole conversation, which is how he was as efficient as possible when he was designing new sounds in the game. And he uses a lot of nested events in order to create building blocks that can then be used to form many, many different sounds. So yeah, check it out. Okay, so you keep mentioning the animals and the creature design, and that's a big part of this
Yes.
prehistoric environment that we're in. Like, do you want to like jump into that? What's like how did you start, first of all? Like,
Oh, okay. So in terms of like design or implementation?
let's see. I guess a bit of both because it's both interesting. Like,
Okay.
so like, how do you design dinosaur sounds? There is no. I mean, there are dinosaur libraries, but they're not like source Foley, right?
Yes. Yes. So
Own take on that, I guess.
a big thing for me is that for the creature sounds, I really try not to use pre-designed elements, right? Where it's just out of the box dinosaur raw O1. I don't like doing that for the dinosaurs because I think it's really important that, we've given them our own designs. These are prehistoric kingdom animals, not just random extinct animal. This is our animal, so it should also sound like our animal. So it usually starts with the concept art, just looking at what we're actually going for the dinosaur or something. and kind of thinking about, okay, well, what is the vibe? Is it friendly? Is it not friendly? Should it be cute? Should it be kind of a freak? Like, what's the angle here? And so in terms of source material, it's a lot of animal sounds, obviously, because you want it to sound organic. You want it to sound like an animal. But a bit of secret sauce is a lot of boom libraries. I think it's like the creature construction kit that has so many excellent like little gargles and hisses that if you put that down low, kind of stretch them out, it's like glue. It's like the perfect way to stitch all these different sounds together. It's so good. I know it's getting pretty old now. I think it was like 2013, 14, maybe when it came out.
That's old
But
school.
that's
That's classic now.
yeah, yeah. But in terms of implementation, uh, it's very templatized, if that's a word. Like it's very template driven, um, which has been very, very important for me. So if I grab, what's a good example?
These are templates within Fmod you're talking about.
Yes, and I use template very usually because Fmod doesn't really have templates. It's basically just me creating a folder hierarchy and being like, yep, that looks good. And then I'll duplicate it when I want to make a new animal. So if we come down here, you'll notice that, hopefully this is big enough on the screen. We have composite and source folders. And this is a huge part of my workflow in the game because essentially I have a bunch of, as I call source sounds, like little growls like this. So these are just some 1 second growl variations. But we also have another animal. And so what you'll notice if I flick through some of these other, I guess, family types, is I actually share single events for multiple animals. I don't have like growl 1 for the T-Rex and then growl 1 for a similar animal. Like they're all in just one event. And we use parameters to essentially tell Fmod, hey, like which sound should we be playing? Which has been so good for setup because I just worry about making one event and that's it.
That's fantastic. So depending on the dinosaur, you have this basically library of sounds
Yes.
call from inside of Fmod, right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
And this has been incredibly instrumental because it means that if I were to go to, let's say, something like this, or yeah, something like this. I basically have these kind of source events where I can put in all my original source material, my essentially construction kit of animal sounds, and I can build new sounds from that. So, for example, this is just a, I think it's like a hiss. But then if we kind of change it to the next animal, it's the same event, right? But you're changing that kind of source material. Trying to see if there's any more. This one's pretty cool. So again, it's that same principle of like, these are our kind of source events, and then this is the composite, right? This is bringing everything in. But this is where all the 3D stuff happens as well, which we can get into in a second. But if I play this, that one has a bit of a cutoff.
Nice.
Right, so it's the same thing, but different source material.
Hey, really quick, if you're enjoying this video, please like the video, leave a comment below, let me know. That way, hopefully I can reach out to more people who will find this information useful. Also, if you're interested in a career as a composer and sound designer like Byron or myself, then I have a free newsletter, and the description below will have a link to it where you can sign up to a free video course explaining a bunch of tips and tricks that I used at the start of my journey. Amazing. And this is all, just to come back to it. So you've made these template events and folders for the source material in Fmod, and then you're calling upon these as nested events, right? As events.
Yes. Yeah. So
relevant animal.
If I were to click on this flutter, for example, this is a unique source event that's down here in this folder. Yep, here's the flutter.
Right.
And so the way I kind of handle it is that like any completely unique sound that is just kind of unique to an animal, I'll chuck it into its own little source folder depending on the species. But then things for like growls or like little vocalization bookends, which is essentially like the transient and the tail, I guess, of a vocalization. That stuff is pretty generic across the family group, so they all get put into kind of the family group source folder, if you will. But then we take all that source and we put it into these big composite events.
Fantastic. This is basically avoiding you having to create, I don't know, if you have like 100 dinosaurs, creating 100 different unique sounds inside of Reaper, exporting them all, exporting their variations, and then putting them in events. Instead, you're doing this
Yes.
like a handful of source material. You're being very efficient, basically.
Yes. Like, don't get me wrong, we do have like hundreds of sounds per animal, but I mean, like here, for example, you can see I've taken this 1 second growl and I've pitched it down by a few semitones. So even though it's the same asset, right, it sounds a little different than how it would be played in another event. Uh, and that's really, I think, one of the biggest, like what the hell's going on here, right? Like this is kind of what makes Fmod so special is that, you know, you can do things like this. You can be like, yep, I'm just gonna build this new sound out of my existing sounds. And that's it. You don't have to go into Reaper. You don't have to do anything like that. As long as you have the material in Fmod, you can do it, which is awesome.
I could not agree more. I think this is the way we should be. Can we hear that again, by the way? Because that was lovely.
Oh, that's the other thing is that obviously these all have their own variations inside. So as you replay it, it's going to be different every time.
I love that. That one's so emotive. So like
Yeah.
chatty.
Yeah, no, he's for all the dinosaur fans, that's how Dilophosaurus. It's the little got two crests on his head. He's really a beautiful animal.
Okay, before we go into like implementation, like you mentioned, so you mentioned something that was really interesting to me. Like when you're designing the sounds for the dinosaurs, one of the variables, one of the data that you're using to drive it is, are they friendly or are they not friendly?
Yes.
Like, so how do you, coming from a sonic, I mean, you must have figured out how to define that, I guess, sonically speaking, having done it so much. Like, how would you define that?
Okay, so really it just comes from like looking at animals. Like when I have a new dinosaur to design, I'm like, okay, well that's kind of cute. It's kind of friendly. A lot of it really is kind of leaning into existing animals. Like I'm thinking of like rabbits or like small mammals. Like what makes them cute? So if I go to uh doo -doo -doo, this animal, if I play this, that's the kind of palette I would lean into for like, yep, I want this thing to be cute. Whereas if we were to go get something like again, going back to our Dilophosaurus, you know, this is for like just a generic snarl loop. So if we ever have an animation where it needs to snarl, I'm like, okay, well, I got a sound that can kind of work for that. You know, you're looking at like dogs. I think I have like geese hissing. That is like a rattlesnake. Yeah, this is a goose. So you're kind of just playing into, I guess, the animal kingdom as we know it and being like, okay, well, how can I take those sounds that I think are cute or kind of scary and then push them to sound like dinosaurs, you know? Because I guess it's kind of like humanizing them in a weird way, but it just kind of works, like pushing those emotions onto them depending on their design qualities.
It's interesting how if you listen to them on like face value, if they were just like sine waves with a bunch of, you know, processing on them, the aggressive ones have a lot more distortion, a lot more saturation, right? They feel raspier or something, whereas the other ones feel more, the cute ones feel like tonal and more like musical
More
and
round almost.
round. Yeah, right.
Like you can see here in this waveform for the flutter, like, you know, yeah, there is still some spooky hissing in there, but you still have those kind of like tonal elements, which I use everywhere because if you like pitch it up a little bit, oh, we can actually even roll off some of that low end a little bit.
Hmm.
And you can kind of make variations within these kind of composite events just to kind of, I guess, what am I trying to say?
Yeah, exactly. You're using
You know
this
what I mean?
Fmod, right? It's
Yeah.
the life of like one source file to be used with like multiple events. Thanks,
Yes.
thanks to middleware, basically. And I think that's
Yep.
exactly the way we should be using it for sure. Cool. So that's it for this first part. Be sure to catch the second part very soon when I upload it, where we'll be talking about how Byron used the built-in parameters, how he mixed the game, and a little insight into the adaptive music system as well. If you enjoyed it, please tell me in the comments below. Just say, hey Sergio, I love this video. Please make another one so I know that it's been useful. If you also have a question for myself or Byron, please put it in the comments below and we'll do our best to get back to you. Cool. All right. See you in the next one.